right, thank you all so much for coming. My name is Birch Maletki. I'm the Emerging Issues Coordinator at the Ruckelshaus Institute. And thank you also to the weather for snowing last week and not today, so you were all able to travel here safely. First up, to welcome us, I'd like to introduce John Koprowski, the Dean of the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Wyoming.
Thanks so much, Birch. Let's also give a round of applause to Birch for putting this all together. She's been the main driver. Thanks so much, Birch. And it's been a huge team, so you'll hear about them later on, but wanted the chance to thank Birch. Well, welcome everyone. I'm John Koprowski. I'm Dean of the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources here at the University of Wyoming. Welcome you to our campus. It is a great pleasure to see so many folks together here willing to start chatting and really make a difference. So look forward to peeking in every once in a while over the next couple of days. This is an Emerging Issues Forum hosted by Ruckelshaus Institute. I think many of you know the Ruckelshaus Institute. It sits within the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources and has a long history of collaborative practice and getting people together, chatting, listening, hearing, and trying to make things happen. That comes from Bill Ruckelshaus, the namesake, and someone who's long committed to collaboration and partnership in a variety of issues. He's served in government for a long time. We lost him a couple of years ago, but the Institute bears his name because of the importance that he felt and we feel why collaboration is necessary. So thank you so much for arriving today. You don't live in Wyoming if you don't appreciate our wild and working lands. And that's really what brings us together here. It's what brings everyone together in the state of Wyoming. To me, it's an incredible opportunity to have something that is so visceral and so integral to every member of the state. We all value those wide open spaces. We all value being able to have working lands that are where we obtain our livelihood. And that's what brings us together as residents. It's what brings us together at the table to start these collaborative discussions. And it's what brings us here today. These are images that I think we all think of when we're looking at our wild and working lands, the kinds of things that show the many values that we have for these lands, the many ties that we have, and the importance of the future of these lands. And as we meet today in this Emerging Issues Forum, there are three goals. We want to increase awareness and understanding of state trust lands. We want to discuss the challenges that limit the Office of State Lands and their investments' ability to effectively manage natural resource funds. And we want to identify strategies and pathways forward. Ultimately, what we want to do is not just sit around and listen for a couple of days. We want to sit around and chat. We want to sit around and hear each other. And we want to come away with some momentum, some new ideas, new relationships that can help us move forward and continue to make sure our wild and working lands are there for the future. And so ultimately, it's all about making a difference for our wild and working lands. I thank you for joining us for the next couple of days. I hope to meet you in person, but just know I'm most appreciative of the time and effort that it takes to dedicate a couple of days to this kind of discussion, and appreciate the opportunity to welcome you to the University of Wyoming. Thank you.
All right, and next up we have Stacia Berry, the Director of the Office of State Lands and Investments.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for this land forum. This is a unique opportunity for all of us to gather to have constructive conversations about managing an incredibly important resource for the state of Wyoming. As Bruce mentioned, Barry. I am the new director of the Office of State Lands and Investments, and I have finished 2 whole weeks on the job. So I am very excited to be here in my 3rd week of work, along with staff from our office, to connect with you, to engage with you, to hear your ideas, to brainstorm with you about potential and opportunity ways to manage state lands and that asset. I think about a quote from one of my favorite authors when thinking about how we manage state lands. And she likens work that we do today to planting a tree. And we don't plant a tree today in anticipation of enjoying its shade. We plant a tree today in anticipation of the shade that it will offer for future generations. And I think right now we are reaping the benefits of the good work that has been done in managing state lands and those assets. And my hope is that from today going forward, we continue to do that work knowing that we are working for a generation of Wyomingite that we will never meet, but that are the children of our future that will thrive and hold the future of our state. So I thank you for your input today. I look forward to learning from you and to meeting you. Thank you. And I have the opportunity to introduce our first speaker of the day, which he is not a stranger to probably any of you in the room, and that is Jason Crowder. He will be presenting today and 101 of state lands and how they came to be today. So if you will please welcome our first speaker of the day, Jason Crowder.
Well, good morning, everybody. It was fun to walk across the stage again. I felt like I'm getting another diploma up here. But there's nobody else to shake my hand, so it's just me, and I appreciate that, I guess. I am not 100% sure how to roll the slides through. You got it or I got it? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. Again, my name's Jason Crowder. I appreciate everybody that made the time to come, travel the distance that it took you to get here to listen to this issue. And what's amazing, when you look out in the audience, there is such a diverse group of people here. We have users, we have paying users, we have recreational users, and most importantly, we have the legislature here. An amazing representation of the legislature. Some of you have worked with our office. You've gotten some things done the way you wanted. You had some hiccups, and so we'll go through that a little bit. But there's a lot of new legislators in the room and new county commissioners as well to, I think, learn about how state lands became what they are, why they are, and how you can work with your constituents within the sideboards or the framework to help them move forward in whatever they want to do on those lands too. So thank you all for coming. Again, want to recognize Bridget Hill, soon to be Justice Hill, previous director of state lands, and Jim McGagna too, previous director of state lands. So thank you guys for coming as well. Let's see. So we're going to start. I'm going to just walk around, and I apologize if you've got a camera, but I can't stand in one spot. So we'll start with just the foundation, the Office of State Lands and Investments. It's the administrative arm to 2 separate boards, the State Board of Land Commissioners and the State Loan and Investment Board. It was statutorily created to carry out the policy directives of those 2 boards. But the boards really, they're the ones who make all the decisions and the policy directives for the office to follow. Our mission statement in the office is effectively managing natural resources and funds for current and future generations. And we're structured, I'm going to say we a lot, because this was a very fresh step away from me. So it was my home, and I'm going to say we, and I'm not going to apologize for it anymore, because I still feel like it's part of my blood, and that's just who I am, I guess. It's set up in this structure. We have the director that oversees the agency with a deputy director, and then 4 divisions underneath it. The first is the Trust Land Management Division. This is really the business division that handles all of the leasing, all of the oil and gas, the grazing, the coal. We're starting to look at renewable leasing in more of a cohesive way. Everything that happens on the land runs through this division from the business sense. All of the real estate transactions as well run through that division. Next, we have the Administrative Services Division. This is the money division, and as I get into this presentation, you're going to see why this is so important. This is where the hundreds of millions of dollars that comes in as revenue gets managed, gets appropriately distributed back out to the beneficiaries, but also these individuals pay the bills, and so they're extremely great people to have on your side. The other part is they audit all the royalties that come in so that we ensure that we're getting paid appropriately from that oil and gas industry that we care so much about. And then also they handle what's kind of the third arm of what the office does, which is the grants and loans. So the legislature has provided a pathway for state-funded programs to help cities, towns, and counties, has also allowed us to partner with federal partners like the EPA to do water and sewer projects, even to do farm loans, things like that. But this division manages that whole structure, and it is kind of that separate third arm that we won't get into much today because they don't really have that trust perspective, but they do an extremely important job for the state. The Field Services Division is one of my passions as well. These are the guys that have the most fun, but have probably the most responsibility as well. They are the boots on the ground. They ensure that the leases that are placed out there are being done appropriately or being managed appropriately. They're being done in compliance with the rules and regulations in all of the lease terms. But there's been 5 of them, very few to manage the millions of acres across the whole state. We've been successful in pushing field offices out so we can get people closer to the land and closer to those users, but it's an immense amount of work for very few people to ensure that that compliance is being done. So they really rely on the relationships that they can build with different users, especially the grazing users, to tell them when something needs to receive some attention. This division also manages the IT, and I say IT in quotation marks, but mostly our GIS program. We have a fantastic map on the website that shows all of the uses, all of the ownership patterns can be manipulated in a bunch of different ways to not only allow the public to understand how the lands are situated and what else is there, provides contact information. If you're a hunter and you'd like to go hunt on that land, you can call somebody up. But it also allows business and industry to look what potential property may be out there and how much it may be going for on a lease basis. And you can use that information as you're developing your business plans. They also handle all of our appraisal practices. So every time we do a real estate transaction, the appraisals are run through that division. They're reviewed through that division. And then lastly, we have the Wyoming State Forestry Division. It manages all of the state's forest and provides services to private forests across the state as well. They do a lot of federal grant work on private and state forest lands, and they do a lot of work through the Good Neighbor Authority now on federal lands, trying to get timber moved in this state to keep that industry going as much as possible. And then probably the thing they get the most press for is they handle all the wildfire management across the state as well. So last year they were extremely busy with that. Hopefully this year that slows down a little bit for them. But they were successful in doing a great job last year, also increasing their capacity as far as people on the ground to help with that fire management to support the counties. But through the legislature, they were also successful in adding another helicopter to their remuda and also another crew for a seat plane, a single engine air attack plane. So that division is growing very well to the need of what's happening out when we have wildfires. As I mentioned, the office serves 2 boards. The first is the State Board of Land Commissioners. I don't know if it's me or how I'm holding the mic, but I'm going to ignore it again. It was constitutionally created. It was not legislative created, this board. The legislature did ratify the Constitution creation of it through statute, but it was created by Article 18, Section 3 of the Constitution. And like I said before, the OSLI director will serve as the secretary of that board. And it manages all state trust land, and we'll get into that in just a minute. The second board, which manages all investments for the state, is the State Loan and Investment Board. That was created by statute, Wyoming Statute 1134-102. And again, the OSLI director serves that as the executive officer. We're not going to talk much about the SLIB side because we're not going to talk a lot about the funding or the grants and the loans. We're here for land management, and that largely sits with the State Board of Land Commissioners. Over the last 5 years, we've had an amazing impact to the state's trust beneficiaries. And I'm going to say the word beneficiaries quite a bit. We'll get into those just a little bit more in detail. But over the last 5 years, uses of state land have generated over $818 million for those beneficiaries. And specific, just to K through 12 funding, a lot of us talk about these blue squares as being school lands. So just specific to those blue school lands, $548 million over the last 5 years, just from paying uses off of state land. So one thing that I find extremely intriguing is that the founders of our country had a fantastic vision for how to help states get going, and a fantastic vision that education was a key component of that. So they granted every state that came into the Union after the original colonies certain trust lands to use for the benefit of school children, to help states develop that school system. Every state, like I said, in the West received those lands. Not all these states still hold those lands, but this is the states that did receive trust land for that purpose. This is how we kind of came into it through the state of Wyoming, through the Organic Act. It talked about these lands that were set aside and dedicated for the common school beneficiary. And it talked about there will be certain lands that will be presented to the state of Wyoming, specifically section 16 and 36 in every single township, for that distinct purpose for supporting the school system in Wyoming. This thought originated in the Organic Act, and it carries through into the Constitution, and then it also carries through into state statute. So we'll start with the Constitution. Article 18 specifically says, and I think this is probably why we're going to give this talk first, because it's rather foundational, that there is a very strict purpose for these lands. A lot of people talk about them as public lands, but when we read the Organic Act and when we read the Constitution, it doesn't say for the benefit of the public. It says for the benefit of specific beneficiaries. The common school system, and then several other beneficiaries, like I said, we'll get into. But I wanted to highlight these top things, which really didn't fit all on the slide. I apologize for that. But the first one, and I want to read this because this is straight out of the Constitution. The proceeds from the sale and rental of all lands and all other property donated, granted, or received, or that may hereafter be donated, granted, or received from the United States or any other sources shall be inviolably, Bridget, you have to help me with these words, these big words, appropriated and applied to the specific purposes specified in the original grants and gifts. So if the U.S. government said you will have these 4.2 million acres for specifically common school or school land support or school children support, that's what they're for. Everything else that comes second to that is second to that. So recreation, all of that stuff comes second to that. It has to benefit what that original grant stated the beneficiary would be. Next, the Constitution gave some framework. Like I had mentioned, it accepted all of the lands that the federal government was providing to the states. Specifically for Wyoming, Article 18, Section 1 accepted that land, and then Article 18, Section 3 created the Board of Land Commissioners, and it said it shall have direction, control, disposition, and care of all lands granted to the state. So these lands are owned by the state, but they're held in trust for the benefit of those beneficiaries, and the Board of Land Commissioners serves as the trustee for those lands. So let's talk about the Board of Land Commissioners. They are the statewide 5 elected officials. So we have the governor, the secretary of state, state auditor, state treasurer, and the superintendent of public instruction. And again, these guys are constitutionally charged to optimize revenue from state trust lands to support education and those other beneficiaries. Article 18, Section 4, starts talking about how the legislature will also play into this. And so what it says is that the legislature can enact necessary laws for the sale, disposal, and leasing of all lands granted to the state. And it will also pass laws for the suitable safekeeping, transfer, and disbursement of grant funds. And I apologize how those words moved around. But it is to work hand in glove with the Board of Land Commissioners to promote that initial foundational purpose for these lands. You have these lands, they're for a specific purpose, and the legislature will help you get there. That's how we interpret the Section 4 of that article. When we talk about the act of admissions after the Organic Act, I wanted to make sure that these words were up here for you, that it did talk about separating these lands for solely the benefit of those beneficiaries. This is where we start talking about specific things that we've all talked about in this room. I'd like to buy some land, but we have to sell it at public auction. And this is where that starts to appear within the Constitution and the Act of Admission. It also says, but shall be reserved for school purposes only. So we're again back at the time of Wyoming Act of Admission. We haven't talked about a lot of other beneficiaries, but they were very specific to say, but shall be reserved for school purposes only. Obviously, we're not going to put a school on every piece of land, and we're not going to put a kid on every piece of land and educate them. But what we can do is generate revenue from those lands to benefit our school system as we know it today. Wyoming statute, as I mentioned, moves this thought process forward. It says the Board of Land Commissioners again shall have the power and authority to promulgate rules not inconsistent with state law, and for the purpose of direction, control, disposition, and care of all state lands, and to preserve that value. And those are words that, again, you saw in the Constitution earlier, so the legislature brought that forward. But what I also wanted to highlight here was at the bottom of that statement is to recognize the fiduciary duties of the state land office. I think we get into a lot of conflict where the state land office may pursue a specific action, activity, and it gets heavy criticism because of that pursuit. But what's lost in that criticism is that the office has a fiduciary duty, a duty higher than all others, to review all of that, to provide the Board of Land Commissioners with the best possible recommendation it can, even if it's a fruitless effort. We are required as the state land office to do that in the statute. The legislature requires us to do it. So we like to highlight this as much as possible to say we may originally feel like an idea is a bad idea, but we have a fiduciary duty to analyze it, to review it, and make sure it's a bad idea. Or it could turn out to be a good idea. But we're going to go through that effort, and we're required to do that. So the statutory principles that the office, and largely the board, but mostly the office, review and try to provide support for the board in, is the state trust land shall be managed under a total asset management policy. Some of these are found in statute. Some of these are found in I didn't want to say case law, but again, I traveled a lot, Stacia, yesterday, so I'm losing my words. We'll come back to that in a minute. But they're not explicitly all written in statute. They could be found in other places, but it essentially tells the office that you need to manage under a total asset management policy. And what that means is not only all of the uses of state land need to kind of work together, oil and gas, grazing, recreation, renewables, but also you need to use those funds in an investment way. You need to generate money from the stock market. You need to generate money from appreciation. Those types of things is how we've interpreted total asset, and we try to do that in a sustainable way. Which leads to the next point, which state trust land is intergenerational and must be managed with a focus on protecting that corpus. So we don't chase the fast dollar, the dollar that's here today, but what is sustainable? And as Stacia mentioned, the shade of the tree that comes for the next generation, we want to make sure we're positioned and poised to take advantage of that when it shows up. Also, state land should remain a substantial component of the trust portfolio. A lot of the states that I showed that had stars in them that no longer have state lands, they sold all of their land. They thought it would be better suited in an investment rather than in land. However, the statutes and the legislature has told us you need to keep land as a substantial component. So while we do have a very robust common school fund, we also want to keep a very robust amount of acres under ownership. All leases shall provide a fair market value in return, and so that's where the Field Services Division and their appraisal crew ensures that we are leasing at fair market values. And a lot of folks want to say that we should get a break because we're working on state land, because it might be government land and we're not really benefiting a specific person. We are benefiting beneficiaries as if they are people, specific people that will benefit from that funding. And we do have to derive that market rate. So we will appraise, we will try to understand what the market is, and we will be right there where the market is to the best of our ability with the information that's provided. Obviously, Wyoming's a non-disclosure state, so sometimes this appraisal work is a little hard to do, a little hard to get that information pulled in. But we don't want to be the cheapest game in town, and we also don't want to be the most expensive game in town. We want to be where the fair market rates are, and that's what our staff strives to do every day. And then investment policies must protect the permanent land fund from effects of inflation. And that's going back to the State Loan and Investment Board, how they determine certain investment categories where they will put the money, but they want to make sure that that fund is growing to protect itself from inflation. I mentioned the beneficiaries a lot, and we still will. These are the beneficiaries. These are the land grants and the funds that originally were identified in the Constitution, and then how over time on the beneficiary side those names have changed, but they're largely the same correlation 1-to-1. There's roughly 13 of them here, but there's a lot of different types of beneficiaries that I don't think a lot of people understand that we're benefiting, and we don't raise one above the other. Obviously, 86% of our lands are tied to the common school system, but that doesn't mean they get the prime real estate transaction that may come. Every piece of land is treated equally so that every one of these beneficiaries have the same benefit or opportunity for benefit going forward. So the trust assets are, one is the trust land. We were originally granted 4.2 million acres. We now hold 3.4 million surface acres and 3.9 million subsurface acres, with a state permanent land fund over $6 billion today. Again, that state permanent land fund didn't have any more funds tipped into it. It is all from the non-renewable uses, non-renewable revenue off of state land. And I should explain that a little bit. When we sell a grazing lease, we can do that year after year. That grass will regrow and we can resell the AUM year after year. We can do that for a recreational permit as well. But you can't sell the same barrel of oil and you can't sell the same acre twice. And so when we do one of those non-renewable activities, like a sale of an acre or sale of a barrel of oil, that's what goes into the state permanent land fund, and that's what's created the $6 billion balance, which I think is very impressive. This is how the 16s and 36s are scattered across the state of Wyoming. As you can see, we are very strategically placed everywhere in the state to manage every single situation that might arise. If that's recreation, if that's sage-grouse core area, if that's migration paths, we are involved in it to some extent because we have the very strategic shotgun pattern. One thing that also does is creates a giant opportunity for relationships. You can see on the eastern side, we have private land surrounding us almost completely in a lot of cases. And on the western side, we have federal land surrounding us on all sides in a lot of cases. So we are very much relying on how those neighboring landowners operate their lands from an oil and gas standpoint specifically. But when we talk about on the west side with the BLM and a little bit the Forest Service, anytime they have a management action that might restrict use, even if that's a reduction of AUMs or an absence of approval of APDs, we are very much stuck with that, and we're impacted by that. We have gone through some effort over time to pull acreages together, because managing a 640 by a 640, or if it's something less, is extremely inefficient. And sometimes we're not optimizing the revenue that we could off of that. But if we can consolidate the acres together, we can increase that efficiency, thereby increasing the revenue we can derive from those acres. And over the last 20 years, we have been successful in acquiring, either through straight acquisition or exchange, several ranches across the state. Some of my favorite, and since I'm up here, I get to talk about them, is the X-Bar Ranch Exchange, which is just outside of Laramie here. It pulled in 41 different separate parcels of state land into one 12,000-acre ranch. It increased the revenue. At the time, I think it was 3.5 times. And Cody, you may have to remind me what we're leasing it for today, but it's over $100,000, if I remember correctly. And he's nodding yes. So that, north of 100. So we were able to exchange out of isolated parcels that relatively did not have any public access into 12,000 acres that did have public access. We increased our revenue from $30,000 to $40,000 to up to $100,000, which with that transaction. And so it's those types of things that it really moved the ball for our beneficiaries. And the largest one in that transaction, again, was the Common School Fund. So the how. Birch wanted me to touch on this quite a bit, and I think we need to start blending historic uses with new and emerging uses now. So obviously the historic use, grazing and agricultural leasing, that's been here forever. Even before the state was a state, we were doing that. We pulled in oil and gas as well as that became more prolific across the state, and that's really the state's bread and butter, is grazing combined with oil and gas. The most prevalent use, 98% of our lands have a grazing lease on them. However, the most economically beneficial use is oil and gas, and we'll get into that in a minute. But as you can imagine, being a landowner, like many of you are, excuse me. Anything that can happen on the land happens on state land. So people need roadways and power lines across our land, so we'll do that through easements. People need temporary access or want to do a temporary recreational thing or outfitting. We'll do that through a temporary use permit. They want longer-term industrial uses like ancillary oil and gas development, larger evaporative ponds, and again, since we're oil and gas heavy in this state, a lot of these larger industrial type uses will be oil and gas centric, but we'll do that through a special use lease. And then we'll obviously do the land exchanges and sales to help promote positioning, I guess, to take advantage of anything that might come in the future. One of the things that we talked about a lot with a transaction that didn't move forward was the Columbus Peak Exchange. And in that exchange, we were looking to remove ourselves from a piece of property that may have topped out in its revenue streams that we can handle anyway, and get into a piece of property that had more and new revenue streams that were available. So there was power on site, there was gas on site, and there was a county road on site. We had the opportunity to develop for residential use, opportunity to develop for commercial use, but that sales, exchanges, and acquisitions is a very important key to finding the shade in the future. If we can position those lands in a way that when those markets show up or when tempers of the board get a little bit more friendly to maybe residential development, or that residential development actually shows up to the area, we're positioned to take advantage of that. But what we're also doing is recognizing that there are new things coming online that could help normalize the revenue stream. When I get into a couple more slides, you're going to see that our revenue stream goes up and down, really based on the price of a barrel of oil. But if we can normalize that, stabilize that to some certain extent, then the beneficiaries have a normal revenue stream that they can expect. The legislature has a normal revenue stream that they can distribute out. And when we need to do that, we look at renewable energy leasing as one of those new things that's coming online. So we have 11 wind leases across the state. We don't have any solar leases at the moment, but that's one of the things that I hope we talk about here today or in this forum. That what can we do to take advantage of those types of uses to help normalize the revenue stream curve. We're also doing that through carbon capture leasing. We have 2 leases within the state, one in the center of the state and then another one in southeast Wyoming here. But it's a new thing that the state of Wyoming hasn't really taken advantage of in the past, nor has really the other landowners in the state taken advantage of in the past. So we're jumping into that with both feet to say this is new outside of the old and what we're used to, and let's see how that normalizes that revenue stream. But it also helps promote those industries as they come into the state of Wyoming, because you just can't do these large-scale projects without a parcel of state land included if you're going to benefit private landowners, if that's something they want to do, or even the federal government. So this is another one of the key things I wanted to touch on, which is extremely foundational. The legislature has given us some directive for objectives on how to manage these lands. The Board of Land Commissioners has further refined that into what we call the trust land management objectives. And this is a set of objectives that we analyze every single time we look at a real estate transaction, we look at a long-term lease, or even a short-term lease, but we run it through these trust land management objectives. It's important to note when I get into them that the proposal, any of those proposals, don't have to meet all of the objectives. They could just meet one and we can still move forward with it. The other is that they're ranked highest to lowest. And so they don't have to always provide a public benefit, a recreational access benefit, or they could and only do that. They could only provide a revenue benefit, and we can move through the process with it. But we have to make sure that we're meeting the beneficiaries' short and long-term objectives before we go into anything else. And that one of those short and long-term objectives is obviously revenue. We talk a lot about that. So what can we do to improve the revenue potential or revenue streams? And then the next is that sustainability piece. What can we do for the investment value of that parcel? Will doing this real estate, doing this longer term lease, actually devalue that parcel to a point where we don't think it's a good deal to move forward with anymore, or will it increase its value? So that's one of the objectives we look at. The second is to improve manageability and efficiency, and we talked about consolidating ownership patterns. But with the relatively small staff within OSLI, 106 now I believe, and only 5 of them out in the field, we can't be everywhere and we can't do everything on our 3.4 million surface, 3.9 million subsurface. So what can we do to leverage the Game and Fish Department, to leverage the Department of Environmental Quality, OGCC, BLM, Forest Service, even the Sheriff's Office? What will this new thing do to help us be more efficient in that area? And then the third and the final is to meet a specific school or community need. And that may be to improve stability of a community, provide an opportunity for growth. Outside of Worland, there's a parcel that they've looked at many times to develop residential opportunities on because they can't grow anywhere else. And so we've talked about selling that to somebody or them to help provide that community growth in that area. And then the third, number 3C, the very last one, is to improve access or recreational opportunities. 3C, to improve recreational opportunities. And it's a privilege, obviously, to recreate on state land, and this is why it's that privilege. The Board of Land Commissioners put it on the list, it's on the list, but it's very last because it really doesn't provide the economic benefits the Constitution required, the Act of Admission required, the state statutes require, that the other uses do. Now that doesn't mean that we're not in discussions to see if there's ways to monetize those uses to increase their benefit to the beneficiaries. And we've got some great recreational leases. Right outside of town here, Sarah, is the Pilot Hill recreational area that they pay a fee back to the beneficiaries for recreational use on that property. that brought it up into the first category of objectives and didn't just stay down here. So it's important to know where that sits and why it sits there. And then this is probably one of my favorite slides. And if you want to take a picture, I saw some of you, Catherine, taking pictures, but take a picture of this one. State trust land is not public land. It's trust land. The Office of State Lands and Investments, and these words got messed up, I'm sorry. Office of State Lands and Investments is not the BLM, it's not the Forest Service. We have different missions. We're here to optimize revenue and sustainability, and they are for multiple use and sustained yield. So there's a very distinct difference between the two, and I think a lot of the times the conflict we see is that a lot of people like to combine them. I'm going to skip over the real estate stuff, Birch, if that's okay, and get to the revenue side. So we talked about 86% of the lands being classified as common school. We also talked about the other 14 being a variety of other things like the University of Wyoming and the Veterans Home, and the grazing leases are the most prevalent use. This is a fun graph. It is our revenue over the last 5 years split over the major categories, and you can see how it's cyclical. You can see how it's really dependent on the price of a barrel of oil. One thing that I'd like to mention is that there's a very big yellow bar in 2025, and that is under the category of all other trust land revenue, and that's typically where special use leases, grazing leases, those types of things sit. But we had a great sale, it was called the Kelly parcel sale, sold for $100 million that made that column look extremely good. I'm not sure if we're going to have another $100 million parcel next year. I doubt it. So we'll probably see that drop back down to where the normal $15 to $18 million revenue stream is. One of the things this graph also shows you is that the correlation between mineral development and surface development. So mineral development's in blue, and again, surface is in yellow. How much we rely on the mineral extractive industries in this state for the beneficiary benefit for what we're required to do. 88 to 90% on any given year comes just from oil and gas. So in 2025, that was $100 million. The other 20 million came from those other mineral uses such as coal development, a little bit of gold, trona development, everything else that's not oil and gas. And all of that adds up to the impressive $241 million. But I want to just stress, that's not a normal situation because the sale of the Kelly parcel really does skew these numbers. Cody's going to talk about the Kelly parcel and the sale later, so I won't get into that. But I think, Birch, I will leave it for Q&A here and go from there.
I'm Michael Cusick with Wyoming Pathways. We build trail on public lands for recreational purposes. Has any studies been thought about or looked at in terms of the economic effect of the visitor economy due to recreational amenities? While they may not be paying to access the landscape, they're spending money in towns, and perhaps many of these users wouldn't otherwise be coming. We also know that the trail user is most fond of the shoulder season, spring and fall, so just wondering if that's being looked at all.
Thanks, Mike. I think that's a great question, and we do get that a lot of how do you look at tourism as an impact or a beneficial impact, and we really don't, because the tourism dollars don't flow to the beneficiaries. But that doesn't mean that a specific situation, a real estate transaction or a lease doesn't have that positive or negative impact to that tourism dollar or even how people are able to recreate when they come into the county or into the state. So it's something we can grow into, but since it doesn't have that specific benefit to the beneficiaries, we don't supply that information to the Board of Land Commissioners because that's our fiduciary responsibility is just for the beneficiaries.
Hi, Jason. Len Carlman, Teton County Commissioner. Thank you for that 101 on state lands. I'm really grateful for it. On my way over here, I stayed with some friends in Lander, and I asked them a little bit about their state land parcels that are of interest to their community, under the general idea that every county and certainly every community has one section or another that's special to them. And they highlighted what they called the bus, which I guess an old school bus was parked on a piece of state land for a long time. It's now known as the bus. And it's got grazing lease on it and lots of recreational activity. And they said there'd been a long, many-year effort to organize the recreation on it. It's kind of dispersed and chaotic. And they said that there's a hiccup in the effort in that in order to do I don't know what they really said, but a lease or a structured recreational program, they first had to get consent from the grazing lessee. And I'm curious to know, is that need for consent a policy, a statute? Where'd that come from, and what's it like for you to work with that?
Thanks for the question, Commissioner, and thanks for driving all the way down. It's a requirement given to us by the Board of Land Commissioners rules. It's in recognition that the grazing user, or the surface user as the rules call them, are the boots on the ground. They're the first ones that are going to feel the impact. They're the first ones that are going to feel the impact from a separated use if they have to move on, or lambs don't go near water because trucks are driving down the road, those types of things. So the board recognized that and put into place what we call the surface impact payment. And it's a requirement, and it's intended to bring those two users that are on the ground together. Again, if the office gets in the middle of that, we may mess things up, to be quite honest. We don't know what's best on the ground, they do. And of course, there's a process that we can go through. If they can't come to an agreement, we can come into it. But those two will know the best solution for a compatible use on the ground better than probably anybody. So when we talk about the bus, there is an immense amount of loving or over-loving of that from a recreational standpoint. A lot of mountain bike users go out there and have separated the historic grazing use from its normal use case, I guess. And so the grazing user has been very accommodating to allow that to occur and has tried to manage around it. But we do want to have that done in a sustainable way. And the more trails that get built, the more erosion concerns occur, the more weed concerns occur. And so we want to manage that as much as we can for the future generations under future shade trees. So we have asked and have entertained many proposals to do a long-term lease, to get somebody responsible over the recreational use of that, and then try to marry up the existing grazing with the new recreation that's out there. One of the things, I think you didn't ask this question, but I'm glad you brought up the topic. We are doing this for the long term, right? We've been here for 134 years. Let's try to do it 134 more. Recreational groups sometimes come and go. The people in the leadership positions of those groups come and go, which change the attitude of those groups. So right now, we may have a great group at Pilot Hill, Pilot Hill's the great example, but we have a great group at the bus. But in 5 years, in 10 years, those people may change, new people may come in with different personalities, and we may not have a great group that pays attention to what we think they need to pay attention to, which is erosion, weeds, compatibility with grazing uses. And so we try really hard to put that in a sustainable situation and get a more stable body in place, like the county commissioners. We've done that in Albany County, we've done that in Sheridan County, Bighorn County, Uinta County, where we have brought the county commissioners on board so that they can be the ones that oversee it. We don't have to be the bad guys. The guys closer to the ground can be the bad guys. But they can allow different types of personalities to come and go under a more it's not restrictive, but a more watched scenario than what we can provide. So I wanted to raise that because that's a very good thing. Recreation is important. We can monetize recreation, but we have to do it in a sustainable and manageable way. The surface impact payment's critical as well because those grazing users have a historic need for that property. They may not have a historic right, but they've got that historic need to be out there and understand the land that they're paying for will be available to them when they need it, just like the lease contemplates. So if they can work together and get compensated for a negative impact if it comes, or specifically in the negotiation of how those two use types could occur, that's critical. That's critical to beneficial or benefits to the beneficiaries. It's critical to successful use of those lands from both sides as well. I hope that answered it.
Jason, we've got a question over here.
Senator Hicks, I'm gonna, obviously you are distinguished in this room. Please go ahead of the.
Well, Jason, I have a question on your last slide. You showed that trust lands are not equal to public lands. And then earlier you went through Article 18 in the Constitution, but Article 18 by its very definition says that public lands are those lands accepted lands from the United States of our active admission. So how do you characterize your last slide? So they're not public lands, yet Article 18 in the Constitution says they are public lands. And so maybe could you provide a little more clarity on the distinction between those, because clearly the Constitution under Article 18 defines them as public lands.
I think that's a fantastic question, sir, and bringing that up is important. 134 years ago, the word public probably doesn't have the same meaning as it does today. The word public today means I have free access. That's my land no matter who I am. I can go out there and do whatever I want on it with some sideboards, obviously, but it's mine. It's public. 134 years ago when the Constitution was written, I don't think it had the same context or the same type of use that it does today. That the government, which was made up of the people, obviously, wanted to set up a structure for the states as they were creating themselves and creating the critical education component of themselves. That's a public benefit, absolutely. But it doesn't mean that they're public lands as we use the term public lands today. And I think it's fair to try to describe those two, to say the difference between the word public then and now. That's probably a good addition to that slide because you raise a very good point. And it does raise some confusion when we are pulling together history to show we have sideboards for these lands, to show that we have a specific purpose for these lands, and the word public shows up in that. So I think it's a fair question, but I don't know that we use the word the same as we did before. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that too, to move that conversation forward. I will quickly read the one online. It says, how do the carbon capture leases work? Is that carbon sequestered from land management practices, or is it carbon injected into the mineral assets? So obviously the world of carbon sequestration is very broad, and we've touched on a very small part of it, and that is injection into the ground. It is from industrial uses. Some are out of state, some are in state, but it captures the carbon that's being developed from those industrial uses, and it injects it into the ground through a Class 6 well below the deepest mineral producing zone. They have to have specific criteria for cap rocks to make sure the carbon doesn't seep up, but it's extremely deep in the ground, and the DEQ manages that for us. But the way the leases work is we are part of a larger landowner group. You can think of one injection well will plume out to 2 or 3 sections, and we're part of that 2 or 3 section area. And eventually that plume will come under us. So we charge on a per acre basis to have state lands be part of that project. And then we also get paid a proportional piece of $1 for each ton that's being injected into the ground. And I don't know if it's kind of a vague question. It's a very weedy question. We can get into exactly how the terms of the lease work if you want. But essentially, it's just what can we do to create more multiple uses, make more compatible situations on 1 acre of ground to optimize the full revenue off of that acre of ground without really impacting everybody else. And that's what these projects do, is we're just injecting CO2 way in the ground. It's not impacting anybody on the surface. In fact, our leases don't even allow any surface activity, so they can't do monitoring wells. They can't have the injection well on us. We're just allowing them to use the pore space below that deepest mineral identified zone.
Hi. I noticed when you started out talking about the state lands and how they were defined originally by the growing U.S. country, and the language you talked about, it says will support the schools, or school children sport. You say educational purposes. You say school purposes. And then magically, it started being highest value. It started being fiduciary. It started being only referring to money. And nowhere in the Constitution is it saying that. And so I think that by narrowing the value of the land to money, even your slides, it's money going to the schools. That's only one of the benefits these lands can provide, not only to the schools, but the education that kids get. And so I wonder if you're aware of that transformation.
I am, and thank you for saying the work we do is magical, because I agree. I wanted to jump back. There was a couple points here that I glossed over, but inside the Constitution here, and if you go to the second point, it talks about all funds belonging to the state for the public school purposes are considered trust funds, and then income from the perpetual funds and rents from these unsold lands will go back to the common school beneficiaries. So you're right. And like I mentioned before, it's hard to put a school on every single section of land. It's hard to educate a child on every single section of land. But what we can do is provide fiduciary or financial benefit back to those school kids. Now, what we've also done, I see you shaking your head, you may not totally agree with that, and I appreciate that. But what we also do is provide educational opportunities. So we allow schools to come out and do whatever they need to do for an educational class, an educational day, range days or something like that, out on the land for free. Come and see the land and learn from it from whatever aspect you can, even if that's a wildlife aspect. What we also do is through the Board of Land Commissioners, they said we want you to, if you can, place a school on these lands. So we have a school out just north of Cheyenne. We also have a school in Teton County, and I'll point the one on Teton County specifically. It has the school, it has all the track, it has the administration buildings as well, at a reduced rate. So they've taken the context of making sure we get market rates and combine that with the context that this has to be for an educational purpose, and has given those schools a rate of $100 per acre, which is relatively cheap. And when we talk about Teton County, you cannot find land, even when that school was built many years ago, for that amount of money. So that's a huge benefit to the education that talks about the actual building and the education of those students and the administration. So where we can, we're pulling those together. But on the whole, places like the Red Desert, places even in western or eastern Wyoming, it doesn't make sense to put a school on every single piece of ground. So what we do on those is rent them and lease them, and according to this, bring the funds back to support the statewide education system. And thank you again for calling it magical.
Hi, Jason. Jeff Hansen, Norfolk Land and Cattle near Lander. You and I have talked before on some exchange opportunities, and maybe will in the future. But my specific question is, in one of your slides, you mentioned verbatim, I think it reads, "All leases shall provide a fair market value return." And specific to grazing lease, an ag lease, the 2025 AUM rate, which I think is the same everywhere in the state, 597 if I'm not mistaken, that is a much higher rate than BLM, much lower than a private party transaction. And you had mentioned that in your comments, that you try, there's a broad range there where it falls in. At what point do you look at, though, that 597, maybe 597 in AUM generates maybe $500 a year for a half section or something like that, as an example. What about in the situation though where the underlying value of the property, not the lease rate for grazing, but the underlying property value is some much higher number, so that when you apply that $500 a year return to a property value, it's not such a great deal for the state and the beneficiaries of the state trust lands. If you can comment to that.
Yeah, Jeff, and great job in pointing something that I wanted to jump completely over. So we are required to charge market rates. We're also required to do what the legislature tells us to do. And within statute, it provides a formula for the rate for grazing leases. And it starts out at the market rate, and then it's reduced by a parity ratio, and then it's further reduced by the lessee's contribution to the lease. That reduction is roughly 40, 50, 55% from market rates. And that's where we come up with the 597 per AUM. It's just that. That's the formula that was given to us by statute. You raise an extremely good point, because there are so many areas in this state that are not like the other. The extreme example, and I keep going back to the Red Desert, very low property values compared to Teton County, very high property values. And I think what we tried to show and did a good job of in the Kelly parcel transaction was that had a grazing lease on it. It was charged $5.97 per AUM, about $3,000 per year for a $100 million property, or appraised value $62 million property. Completely out of whack. So the right thing to do for the beneficiaries is to either find a paying use that would be commensurate with the $100 million or the $62 million value, or dispose of it and find something else to do. And Cody's going to talk about that a little bit later, in what else can we do with that money. But you're exactly right. That's a rub that we provide information to the Board of Land Commissioners on every single lease, every single transaction, to make sure that they're aware of that dynamic. But sometimes we are obligated by statute to take a different course, or even the Board of Land Commissioners. They have a very broad discretion on how they can manage these lands. And if they feel the best use is to have the 597 AUM fee rather than do something else that's more commensurate with its value, they can certainly do that.
Hi, Kathy Nyrop. I represent Citizens for the Responsible Use of State Lands. I really appreciated the slide that showed the variability in revenues over the last 5 years. And it brings the question to mind of does the State Land Board have a 25-year strategic plan? How do you anticipate the composition of revenues changing and normalizing or diversifying over that period of time? What do you think the composition of revenues should be 25 years from now for Wyoming?
Higher. Kathy, that's a great point to bring up. And what this does is this graph shows us right in the middle of COVID and coming out. So in COVID, we had $0 oil, or even less, which means we dropped in our revenue considerably. And 2020, 2021, that's where the graph shows that very extreme drop. We don't necessarily have a going forward plan. I think we have the types of uses we'd like to generate revenue from. That's part of our plan. And the plan is essentially we're going to make these lands available pursuant to the Board of Land Commissioners rules. You're available for easements, you're available for oil and gas, you're available for grazing. We're really kind of in a seat of accepting what the market gives us after that. We're accepting the price of a barrel of oil. We can't really influence it. We're accepting the price of an AUM because the legislature influences that. So really, we're just kind of seeing what the market gives us, but we're positioning ourselves as much as possible to take advantage of those opportunities when they come. If it's a recreational standpoint, great. If it's residential development, great. If it's industrial development, great. If it's something that appreciates to a point where we can sell it 50 years from now at a much greater clip than inflation and covers inflation than what we bought it from, that's one of our goals as well. And so it's tied a little bit with the trust land management objectives and the board's rules to look out into the future, but we're largely just accepting what the market gives us.
Jason, Steve Harshman from Casper. Quick question, maybe you could give us a little history. At statehood, we had 4.2 million acres. We've sold off roughly 20% of that. Is there a time when most of that happened? And then what was maybe some of the reaction of the people of Wyoming through its legislature to maybe prevent future sell-offs of another 20%? Thank you.
Representative, I think that's a great question. So when the majority of the states got their lands, they did sell off very early to try to generate a bank account to actually pay from. So you can be, as most of us are, land rich and money poor. And that's what the state of Wyoming was in the very beginning, but it still had to fund the education system. So it did sell off some lands. There was also a small part, a carve out for those who had homesteaded that ground before the state became a state. They were given a preferential right to buy that land at that time, if it happened before the state. So those two things coupled together had probably a very fast sell-off in the beginning. Over time, we've recognized that there are lands that are of higher value, but contain less acreage, I guess. And so as we do exchanges going forward, you'll often see where we may lose a certain amount of state land in that exchange scenario, but the value of it is much higher. The revenue potential is much higher. So that could be a component of it as well. I don't know if I can tell you exactly when the majority of the 20% left, but obviously the Constitution requires that the lands be sold at public auction, which really does limit those who want to go into that process because there's a whole lot of risk involved in that. You don't know who the winning bidder may be. And if you initiate it and you want to buy it, that's a risk you may not want to take advantage of. So that's something the Constitution has put in place. But also the legislature put into place this idea of a cash equalization payment. So there can be a difference between the acreage or the values as long as it doesn't exceed the 25%, doesn't exceed 25% of the highest appraised property. And that kind of limits the amount of acres we're talking about. There's not a wide discrepancy of lopsided exchanges, if you will. We can overcome that with money. And then simply, it should be a trust principle. It is a trust principle. We don't have it written down. But land is always the best hedge against inflation. And so when the legislature said you shall keep land as a substantial component of your asset base, I think that's what they were getting at as well, a part of it. That you need to keep that land to make sure you have a sustainable amount of money going forward. And I think that's something that also limits our just selling it to anybody.
Good morning. Right overhead back here. Hi,
Marguerite, please stand up.
Yes. Reference to my height. So I'm Marguerite Herman for the Advocates for School Trust Lands, and we advocate for the beneficiaries specifically and the management for the to inure to the benefit of beneficiaries. And there's a word we've been using all day long, or all morning long, is trust. What is a trust? If you can just maybe review what are the the legal principles of a trust. When you have a trust, what duties then attach to the trustee, to the beneficiary, and I guess, so, and later on in the conference, how much wiggle room is there within those confinements? But I guess, what are some trust principles that apply to all trust situations, including the trust land?
Thanks, Marguerite. And you are asking a question that's certainly above my pay grade now. I'm not an attorney. There's probably attorneys, many more in this room that can help answer that. But from the office's perspective, we take that fiduciary responsibility to the beneficiaries extremely seriously. And I would correlate that to a trust responsibility, that this asset that we have that is supposed to be beneficial for them and solely for them is extremely crucial and extremely important. And that raises above all other responsibilities. And so if that's part of the definition of a trust and how we manage it, that's fantastic, and I'll pat myself on the back. But I don't know if I can answer that question more fully for you. And what probably should come out of this forum is we have this trust component. Let's make sure we define that and talk about emerging uses and emerging issues with it. The newly minted Justice Hill said she will talk about it.
Good morning, Jason. I'm Steve Williams. I'm a retired professor from the University of Wyoming, and I'm on the Ranch Advisory Commission for the city of Laramie. We own 25 sections out here, mostly for water development, but we are still managing it, and we are thinking about opening it up to recreational users. And I know you say your land is not public land, but there's still recreational users. What liability responsibility do you have on those lands for those users?
That's a great question that I do not. So what I don't have is a statutory reference for you, but there's a limit on liability back to the landowner, and we accept being one of those landowners, for people when they come onto your land and recreate, that you have that limited liability for something that might happen. There's also a component that was changed very recently, and again, I didn't prepare for this, so I'm sorry about that, but it also extends to third-party users. So if you have a lessee on the ground and somebody damages one of their improvements, it speaks to that liability. And also if one of their, I won't say improvements, but let's just say livestock damages recreation out there, there's a limitation on that liability as well. And I'm not fully versed, but I can find that statute for you.
Thank you, J.R. Riggins, Natrona County. Say a number of years ago, this is about state lands exchanges. A number of years ago in Natrona County, there was an exchange proposed for state lands and BLM, I think a small portion of private. And I think under your formulas, it would have been a good deal for the state. And there was actually an improvement to recreation access and especially hunting. But there was a very strong, I believe Governor Sullivan was acting on behalf at a forum there to explain it on the behalf of the exchange. And it seemed to me that public sentiment turned that all the way around. And I was wondering, how do you guys approach those discussions, and what is the strategy to meet those? Because it looked like it would have met your criteria for that exchange.
Representative Riggins, that's a fantastic question, because we're starting to see more and more of that, and it's a pressure that's on the office that we're trying to manage and navigate through to try to get to that positive fiduciary benefit, positive beneficiary benefit. We're seeing a lot more of that. People have an idea or maybe even an entitlement to these lands, and we're back to the public land definition. I've always been able to walk my dog out there, for example. If you exchange it, I won't be able to do that anymore. And that's not anything that we're going to recognize, because that's not a fiduciary benefit, but it's very real to the people who've always used it in that way. So how does the office navigate that scenario and then provide something with the Board of Land Commissioners that they feel comfortable with approving? again, we're going to provide the fiduciary answer, and that's why I wanted to hit that point really hard in the beginning of that presentation, that we're not going to concern ourselves immediately with what's the impact to the dog walker. We're going to say what's the impact to the trust beneficiaries and their benefit from the asset that they have, and provide that to the Board of Land Commissioners for their ultimate decision. We're also going to go and try to, well, not try, but we're going to go and hold public hearings. We're going to accept public comments and allow everybody to have their say in that transaction. But ultimately, and unfortunately probably, a lot of those comments do not talk about the fiduciary benefit, the actual benefit to the beneficiaries. They all talk about their impact to that dog walker. I won't be able to go out there anymore. I won't have the same scenic view shed I've always been accustomed to. So it is a very large conflict that we're working through, because all of the rules, statutes, Constitution tell us to provide a fiduciary benefit recommendation to the Board of Land Commissioners. And the information we're getting back largely from the public is not that. It doesn't say you've done your numbers wrong. It doesn't say you should invest these funds instead of that. It just says you're impacting the dog walker. So I don't know how best to navigate that. That's still an ever-evolving thing. But one of the things that we do need to do is educate. We need to ensure that the public understands the purpose for these trust lands. And that's why every time we hold a public hearing, we talk the first 5 slides. This is who we are, this is what we do, and this is why we're here presenting to you, and this is the purpose of these lands. And then also try to give them as much information as part of education, but give them all the information that we can about the transaction we're working on when we can give them that information. Obviously, there are times where we're dealing with private landowners, and we've done some transactions with some folks in this room that they don't want the idea of a transaction to get out before it has some legs under it. So we're going to hold that in confidence, and the Board of Land Commissioners rules allow us to do that for a period of time. But as soon as we can get it out, we get it out. We let everybody know what we're doing. We put it on our website. We put out as much media blast as we can to make sure, and notice all the county commissioners and legislators in the region, let them know what we're doing. And I think that's part of education as well. But it's a very large conflict that we're working on that there's not a clear resolution to.
Hi. I'm Bill Schwartz. I'm an attorney. I've been involved in some of the litigation involving state lands over the years, and I appreciate all the discussion about management of these properties, but one thing we haven't talked about yet, and maybe you can provide some background on, is once the funds are generated into the permanent trust fund, how do we know that those funds are actually being allocated to the required purposes? For example, for the it seems like kind of a complicated accounting problem, because we have different federal lands that were granted for different purposes, but most of them for support of the public schools. How do we know that all the revenue from 16 and 36, or whatever they ended up being, are actually going to the public schools? I don't hear much talk about how that works mechanically. Like, do we call up to state lands and say, hey, we need some money in Hot Springs County? Who decides that it's actually for school purposes? Second, related to this, has the legislature sought to borrow against these funds and put them into the general fund at any point? So I guess those would be the 2 questions. Thanks.
And great questions. Fundamentally, we have 2 buckets of money. We We have the permanent land fund and the permanent land income fund. And that's where I talked about the renewable versus non-renewable sources of revenue. Non-renewable goes to the permanent land fund, and that's what's created that $6 billion corpus. The renewable sources of revenue go into the income fund. Those are immediately distributable by the legislature. Also, the $6 billion inside the Common School Permanent Fund, the returns off of that investment are also deposited into the Common School Income Fund or Permanent Land Income Fund, and also become immediately distributable by the legislature. So we have reports that we can provide to you that'll show how much money was derived and distributed to those funds, either through Common School, which would have been the 16s and 36s, or any of the other 13 beneficiaries. We can show you how those funds moved around and were deposited for the benefit of them. How they actually get distributed, how they actually get to Washakie County and into a specific school, that's a decision made by the legislature. That's not anything we do. We just populate the funds for the legislature to distribute through their equations and mechanisms. I don't have that information for you, but there are a lot of them here we could ask. I would, absolutely. Okay, 2 more questions online. What are the requirements? Marguerite already talked about the requirements of a trust. Second, for what purposes do you have agreements with state agencies like Game and Fish, state parks, and trails to manage use impacts on state lands? That goes back to our second trust land management objective. How do we efficiently leverage or manage all of the land that we have? And we really rely on those relationships. So we have contracted with the Game and Fish Department to do walk-in areas or hunter management areas that include state lands. A lot of the larger ranches that I had starred up there are under an agreement with the Game and Fish Department to manage recreational access on those properties. We also rely greatly on DEQ, OGCC to provide the regulatory help on any kind of development, oil and gas development, mining. We don't have those bits of expertise in-house. So we really rely on those parties to provide that to us. And we've entered into different levels of MOUs with them. To the state engineer's office, we have an MOU with them to make sure water rights are handled appropriately, that each agency knows what's happening with that water right. And also, we have an MOU with the Game and Fish Department to help us with game warden enforcement, to allow those game wardens for specific situations to come on state lands and provide law enforcement. So greatly rely on those relationships to help manage the immense amount of land.
Joey Correnti, Rural Wyoming Matters. We just talked about the money being automatically generated and sent to at least the districts, maybe down to the schools. But on your last slide, it showed this cute little arrow to a computer saying, hey, this money goes to books and teachers and supplies. Are there sideboards on how this money can be spent? Is it regulated the same way as the regular school budget? Or do we need to add administration and school lunches to the last slide we saw up there?
Well, I really appreciate the last slide because it does show ultimately how these funds flow, where their intended purpose and benefit is, and it's down there to the computer. And if it's a school lunch, we can add that as well. I don't have that information for you. Again, it's a legislative formula and mechanism for how those funds get distributed, and hopefully through this forum we can have more of those conversations. But we just populate the buckets and make sure that the buckets are distributed to appropriately. And how they actually get to the specific computer, we'll have to dig into that topic more.
Jason, I can help answer that just real briefly. Marguerite Herman again. And the renewable income money goes into, and along with the investment income from the permanent fund, because it generates millions of dollars a year in investment income, thanks to our state treasurer, shout out. They do a great job. And it all goes into a foundation account in the state treasurer's office. And that is the account from which schools and as Jason is right. So the legislature sets a funding formula that every school gets, every school district gets. It's a block grant. So it's not parsed out for computers and the football field, et cetera. It's a block grant, and it gets funded from that foundation account. And it's a guarantee to every school district in the state. And so a lot of times it's not enough, so it gets supplemented from other things like federal mineral royalties, severance taxes, all go into that foundation account in addition to the trust income. And it goes out according to this funding formula that is generated by the legislature and will get actually regenerated. It's going to be revisited this summer. But it goes to districts as a block grant, and then they spend it locally.
Thank you. Steve Johnson, House District 8. And I see that you said our AMU is about 597. And I'm just reading Montana's here. It says there's 1653. Is their land 3 times more productive than ours? And what's the discrepancy there?
That's a great question, Representative. And again, so our AUM is derived off of a formula given to us by the legislature, and that's all the difference is. The state of Montana was also at $5, possibly $7 in AUM up until about 15 years ago, and they went through a very large study to see what it would be the appropriate market rate for those AUMs. That allowed the legislature or the board, I'm not sure how they're structured, to increase their rates from the low $5 to $7 to the higher one. So it has nothing to do with productivity. It's simply what does the state, Montana or Wyoming, want to charge. Right now, Montana's at 16 and the state of Wyoming's at 5 or 6. We've also created a report. It's relatively old. I think it was done in 2019 that we should update, but it brings in all of the states, the western states that currently manage grazing on state trust land and what they charge. All of their formulas are completely different. Some are a couple guys sitting at a coffee shop saying, I think this year we should be at $7. Some are extremely difficult to understand equations, to talk about the price of corn in Iowa versus the price of diesel in California and pull all that stuff together. So every state does it a little bit differently, and we could provide that report to you. It's important to note that the state of Wyoming is close to the bottom. It may not be the bottom, and we're not all the way down to the federal government AUM rate, but in that report we found that the state of Wyoming has decided to sell its AUM for close to the bottom. I want to thank you, Birch, thank the Haub School, thank Director Berry for letting me get up and have this conversation with you. And again, thank you all for coming today.